A quiet shift you didn't expect. There's a certain kind of attention that doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't try to impress you. It doesn't even fully reveal itself at first. But you can feel it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that disrupts your life overnight. More like a subtle shift in energy, in conversations, in the way someone looks at you when they think you're not noticing. And what's interesting is, this kind of attention tends to come when you're no longer chasing it. At some point, without making a big decision about it, you just stop trying so hard to be seen. You stopped shaping yourself to fit expectations that never really felt like yours. And strangely, that's when things started to change. Because the truth is, when someone widely admired becomes quietly drawn to you, it's rarely about surface-level attraction. It's about something deeper, something harder to define, but impossible to fake. When you stopped performing for approval, there was a time when you were more aware of how you came across. You thought about what to say, how to say it, how it would be received. You adjusted parts of yourself, not because you were being fake, but because you were trying to connect, trying to belong. And there's nothing wrong with that, it's human. But over time, something started to feel off. You realized that constantly adjusting yourself came with a cost. It made you second-guess your instincts. It made you question your natural reactions. It slowly pulled you away from who you actually are. So you began pulling back. Not dramatically, not in a way that people could easily point out. But internally, something shifted. You started choosing honesty over likability, clarity over impression, peace over approval. And while that may have made some connections fade, it also created space. Space for something more real to enter your life. Because the kind of person who is quietly drawn to you now isn't looking for a performance. They're responding to presence. The kind of presence that can't be taught. There's a difference between being impressive and being grounded. Impressive people attract attention quickly. Grounded people hold attention without trying. And somewhere along your journey, you started leaning into the second without even realizing it. You became more comfortable with silence, more selective with your words, less reactive to things that once would have pulled you in. That kind of presence does something unusual. It makes people feel both calm and curious at the same time. Because most interactions today are predictable. People follow patterns, they say what's expected, they react how others react. But when someone encounters a person who doesn't follow those patterns, it stands out. Not loudly, but deeply. And for someone who is used to being admired, respected, or surrounded by attention, that difference becomes noticeable. They're used to people leaning toward them. So when they encounter someone who simply stands in their own space, without trying to impress, without trying to gain anything, it shifts the dynamic in a way they didn't expect. Why they notice you differently. People who receive a lot of attention develop a kind of awareness. They learn to read energy quickly. They notice when someone is trying too hard. They can tell when interest is driven by image rather than substance. So over time, most interactions start to feel similar to them. Predictable, repetitive, surface level. That's why when they come across someone who isn't operating from that place, it catches their attention. Not because you're trying to stand out, but because you're not trying at all. There's a difference between indifference and self-containment. Indifference pushes people away. Self-containment doesn't chase, but it doesn't close off either. It simply exists. And that's rare. That's what creates this quiet pull. Because instead of feeling like they're being pursued, they feel like they're discovering something. And discovery is far more powerful than attention. The moment you stopped needing validation. At some point, you realize something subtle but important. Not everyone needs to understand you. Not everyone needs to agree with you. Not everyone needs to see your value right away. And instead of forcing that understanding, you let it go. You stopped explaining yourself unnecessarily. You stopped oversharing just to feel connected. You became more comfortable with being misunderstood by the wrong people. That kind of shift changes how you show up. There's less urgency in your energy, less need to prove anything, less pressure to be liked. And ironically, that's what makes people more drawn to you. Because now, your interactions aren't coming from a place of need. They're coming from a place of choice. And people can feel the difference, even if they can't explain it, especially someone who is used to being admired. Because for them, most attention comes with expectation attached. But your energy doesn't feel like that. It feels clean, uncomplicated, real. When interest become as quiet instead of obvious. Not all attraction looks the same. Some of it is loud, direct, and easy to recognize. But the kind that forms around depth tends to move differently. It becomes quieter, more observant, more intentional. You might notice small things, a longer pause before they respond, a shift in how they listen when you speak, a subtle attentiveness that wasn't there before. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't disrupt everything, but it's consistent. And consistency is where meaning builds. Because when someone who has access to attention from many people chooses to focus on one person in a quieter, more intentional way, it usually means something deeper is happening. Not something dramatic, but something real. This is where your identity started changing. The most important part of all of this isn't their attention. It's what changed in you before it ever showed up. Because this didn't start with them. It started with your internal shift. The way you began seeing yourself differently. The way you stopped outsourcing your sense of worth. The way you became more aligned with your own values instead of external expectations. That kind of transformation doesn't always feel exciting while it's happening. Sometimes it feels isolating. Sometimes it feels like you're outgrowing spaces faster than you can replace them. Sometimes it feels like you're in between versions of yourself. But this phase matters because it's where your identity becomes more stable, less reactive, less dependent, more defined. And when your identity stabilizes, your energy changes. And when your energy changes, your interactions change. And eventually, the kind of people who are drawn to you change too, when admiration turns into curiosity. There's a subtle difference between being admired and being understood. Admiration is often based on what's visible. It's about achievements, presence, confidence, or the way someone carries themselves in a room. But curiosity, that comes from something else. It begins when someone realizes they can't quite figure you out. Not because you're confusing or distant, but because you don't present yourself in predictable ways. You don't rush to explain who you are. You don't package yourself into something easy to consume. And that creates a kind of tension, a healthy one. Because now, instead of simply being noticed, you're being observed. And when someone who is used to being admired starts observing instead of leading the interaction, it shifts their role entirely. They're no longer the center of attention in that moment. They're the one leaning in. Why emotionally aware people move differently? When someone has experienced a certain level of attention in their life, they usually learn to slow things down. Not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. They've seen how fast connections can form, and how quickly they can lose meaning when they're built on surface-level excitement. So instead of rushing, they watch. They pay attention to patterns. They notice how someone responds under pressure. They observe consistency over time. And if they're quietly drawn to you, it won't show up in obvious gestures right away. It shows up in patience, in the way they don't interrupt your process, in the way they allow space instead of trying to fill it, in the way they choose timing over intensity. Because real interest, when it's grounded, isn't in a hurry. It's intentional. The unspoken respect that builds first. Before anything becomes clear or defined, there's usually a phase that isn't talked about enough. Respect. Not the kind that's announced or expressed directly, but the kind that builds quietly over time. It forms when someone notices that you're consistent in who you are, that you don't shift your values depending on who you're around, that your energy doesn't fluctuate just to maintain connection. And respect changes everything, because once respect is established, attraction becomes more stable. It's no longer based on fleeting impressions. It's based on trust in your character. And for someone who has seen a lot of temporary attention in their life, that kind of stability stands out. They may not say it, but they feel it, the tension between interest and restraint. One of the most interesting dynamics in situations like this is the balance between interest and restraint. Because when someone feels drawn to you but also recognizes your depth, they don't approach it casually. They become more careful. Not distant, but measured. You might notice moments where they seem close and then slightly pull back. Not because they've lost interest, but because they're processing it, trying to understand what they're feeling, trying to approach it in a way that doesn't disrupt what's already forming. And this can feel confusing if you're expecting clear signals. But when you look closer, the pattern makes sense. There's consistency beneath the restraint. And consistency is always more reliable than intensity. How your BOUNDRIS changed the dynamic. At some point, you became more aware of your limits, what you're willing to give, what you're no longer willing to tolerate, what feels aligned and what doesn't. And instead of explaining these boundaries to everyone, you simply started living them. You stopped overextending. You stopped saying yes when something felt off. You stopped investing energy into situations that didn't feel balanced. That shift does something powerful. It changes how people interact with you. Because now, access to your time and attention isn't automatic. It's earned through alignment. And for someone who is used to easy access from others, this creates a different kind of experience. One that requires presence. One that requires intention. One that can't be rushed. And that in itself becomes part of the attraction. Why this feel like your past connections? If you compare this to previous experiences, something probably feels different. There's less chaos, less uncertainty driven by mixed signals, less emotional highs and lows. Instead, there's a slower build, a quieter awareness, a sense that something is developing, but without pressure. And while part of you might be used to faster, more obvious connections, another part of you recognizes the value in this pace, because it feels more sustainable, more grounded, more real. It's not based on trying to impress each other. It's based on gradually understanding each other. And that kind of connection tends to last longer, not because it's forced, but because it's built with intention. The shift from external to internal validation. One of the biggest transformations you went through wasn't visible to everyone. It happened internally. You started validating yourself, your decisions, your direction, your sense of identity. And while that might sound simple, it changes everything. Because when you no longer rely on external reactions to feel secure, Your energy becomes more stable. You're not easily pulled into emotional highs or lows based on how others respond to you. You're more centered, and that centered energy creates a different kind of presence, one that feels calm but strong, open but not dependent. And that's the kind of energy that draws people in without effort, especially those who are used to interactions that feel more transactional or surface level. When you realize it was never about chasing. At some point, you might look back and notice a pattern. The more you tried to force things in the past, the less natural they felt. The more you tried to hold onto connections, the more unstable they became. But when you stepped back, when you focused on yourself, when you allowed things to develop without pressure, everything started to feel different, more aligned, more natural, more calm. And this situation reflects that shift, because you're not chasing this connection. You're experiencing it, observing it, allowing it to unfold at its own pace. And that changes your role entirely. You're no longer trying to create something. You're deciding whether it fits into your life. This is where your growth becomes visible. Growth isn't always obvious while it's happening. It often feels like confusion, like distance, like outgrowing old versions of yourself. But eventually, it becomes visible through your patterns, through the way you respond instead of react, through the way you choose peace over proving a point, through the way you maintain your boundaries without needing validation. And in moments like this, that growth becomes even more clear, because you're not overwhelmed by the attention. You're not rushing to define it. You're not losing yourself in it. You're staying grounded, present, aware. And that's the real shift. Not that someone is drawn to you, but that you've become someone who can receive that attention without losing your sense of self, a quiet realization you can't ignore. There's something important to notice here. The dynamic you're experiencing isn't random. It's a reflection of how you've changed, of what you now value, of the way you carry yourself, and whether this connection becomes something deeper or simply remains a meaningful interaction. The real takeaway is this: you're no longer attracting from a place of need. You're attracting from a place of alignment, and that changes everything moving forward. If you felt this kind of shift in your own life, the subtle changes in how people respond to you, the quieter but deeper connections, the sense that something within you has evolved without needing to announce itself, it's worth paying attention to. Not to overanalyze it, but to understand it, because these moments often say more about your growth than anything external ever could. And sometimes, the most meaningful changes aren't the loud ones. They're the ones you recognize quietly over time. If this resonates with where you are right now, you can share your perspective below. It's always interesting to hear how others experience these kinds of shifts in their own way.